The element that differentiates the win and loss in a chess game played between two equally matched players are often not laid in their rating points. It is rather a dynamic play from one side that tries to squeeze their opponent. Hello again everyone, welcome back to another video where we talk about some of the middle game ideas that you hopefully can take home or apply them in your own game. I believe a simple Google search can define a dynamic play to be the ability to consistently present your opponent problems while we improve our own position, on the other hand diminishing our own problem. And so it is the game of throwing the most snowballs in your opponent's face, if you will. It often comes at a price of sacrificing a couple of pawns or pieces even, but the problems presented to your opponent will compensate for the sacrifices that you made, for the pieces that you lost. For example, it's my own game where I held white, and I suppose I have tiny edge advantage due to the center control that I have here, and also the pieces activity, which is the knight here controlling many square in the center, and on the queen side and the king side as well. But despite all that, it is not easy to make a breakthrough. The engine suggested something like pawn to h3, and also pawn to a3 for white, trying to just slow play this out, try to see what black does. Well, I do have to admit this is some of the best move that white can continue, and also one of the sensible way to continue. I wanted to play more dynamically. I want to actually just apply something that I learned before in the book into my own game. And so in this position I played knight to d5, knight cd5 exactly. But the idea is after the pawn takes, and after a recapture, we see an open c-file that I control, queen is attacked, and moreover the bishop here is trapped behind my own pawn. The bishop here is not very active. I also have a follow-up plan playing knight to f5, also pawn to h4, pawn to g4, pawn to h5, pawn to g5, to attack black relentlessly to compensate for my lost piece. Black continues with queen to d7, has to get out of the attack of the rook, right, or else we just lose the queen. And then I continue with knight to f5. My opponent responded with rook to c8. One of the best moves in this position is to just try to exchange your some of the major pieces that I have controlling the open file to shut down my counterplay. This is also one of the skills needed to play more dynamically, is the fact that you have to know which one is your worst piece and which one is the best piece for your opponent, and when to trade it off to shut down your opponent's counterplay. Now in this position I had plans to just play pawn to h4, pawn to g4, pawn to g5 as was mentioned earlier. We can slow play this position because black cannot just play pawn to g6, we take on e7 and we take on f6. Whether the queen or the bishop does not matter, we're winning in this position. Unfortunately, black also cannot play logical defense with bishop to f8 because of the same bishop takes f6, and after pawn takes f6, queen g4 check. The rest is easy where I just trade the rooks and play rook to d3, idea of checkmating black down the g file. And so this is really the core of playing more dynamically, is to really give your opponents problem that they can solve easily, and really hope that they can blunder so you can win quickly as possible. I also had calculated pawn to h6 for my opponent, which is probably one of the best moves, but I thought I can just play knight takes h6, and after the recapture I can just take the knight here on f6, I have a menacing queen. Example line would be king to h7, rook to c8 for example, rook to d3, trying to play rook to f3 or rook to g3. If rook to g8, I think we can just play rook to f3, something like this, would be fine for me. In any case, the bishop also cannot get out until he plays bishop to c8. Even then, I suspect that, the prospect is pretty much dim. I don't see any prospect at all. But I saw king to h8 for my opponent, which is tucking a king on the corner of the board plus rook to g8. Then I thought, wait, perhaps this is probably too slow. For example, if queen to g3 has rook to g8, and honestly I don't know how to continue. Perhaps something like queen to f4, pawn to g4, pawn to g5 will help. Either way I found it difficult and actually didn't proceed with pawn to h4. Instead I did queen to g3 with the very same idea that I can't play king to h8. Also, he cannot play bishop to f8 because the knight of course hangs on f6. He also can't play pawn to g6 because then I have knight to h6 check. And let's say he plays king to g7, I have queen to g5. Next idea is knight to f5 check, picking up the knight and the bishop next. For example, b5 is a pass move, knight to f5 check. No matter where the king goes, let's say g8, I play knight to e7, queen to e7, and I picked up the knight, and I win this position. And if he goes king to f8, I have queen to f4, I then have the same attack that we talked about. And if he plays king to g7 and play knight to g4, this time for sure the knight is going to be lost, and all in all it's just going to be bad for black if this goes on. And so as you can see, in this game I've put kind of a bind, if you will, for black by making him playing the only move to have a chance to survive in this position or to win this position. And so this is really the art of dynamic attacking, is that you want to give your opponent the hardest possible problem for them to solve, and if they don't solve it correctly, they lose by a blunder or a forced checkmate. Hopefully I drove the point across with the first game. Again, this is not to show off the fantastic game that I played. As I said, in this position there are many points, there are many approach, and knight cd5 is not the only one. but it does give your opponent some problem to solve, and in this case my opponent does not solve it correctly and lost the game. So I thought it's just a good point to share. The next game I want to touch on based on this dynamic attacking style is the game between Caruana Fabiano and Robson in the US Championship 2021. Now I think it was in this moment where there are 4 grandmasters that says this position is basically not enough for white or black to break through and to make a win. The 4 grandmasters in the studio of St. Louis includes Daniel Dominguez, and they're quite certain that this is going to be a draw. But obviously this is not what's going on in Fabiano Caruana's head. He understands that in order to win he has to make a breakthrough on the queen side, because the king side is quite locked, it's protected by the pawn, protected by the knight. And so he realized he could win if he brought his king to queen side and gobbled the pawn enough to push his own pawn to actually promote. And it's certainly not an easy task. But the next few moves basically operating on that, in which Fabiano Caruana is just bringing his pieces into the king side, on the queen side, especially the bishop here on the queen side, attacking the base pawn on b7 and a6. And so as you can see, they shuffle a lot. Fabiano shuffle, put his pieces in an optimal square, and finally reaches in his position where his king is on c4, ready to jump in on c5. As you can see, it's not possible now because the knight is controlling that square, and so Fabiano Caruana will have to do better to actually get his king to the 5th rank and also the bishop to the 8th rank, attacking the base pawn here. And Ray Robson continues the king to g8, again skipping and not mentioning all the technical issue. I always think that the black king is always nice to actually stay on the queen side, to kind of protect the soft pawn on b7. But okay, king g8 is not any mistake, but then it allows a move from white that blows up the position suddenly. In this position, Fabiano plays bishop to g5, sacrificing a bishop. The idea is the knight is forced to take here on g5, giving the white king access to c5. And suddenly if we look at this position, the king can get into the queen side, and the bishop can roam into the c8 square, attacking the b7 pawn. The skill here that we all have to pick up is the fact that dynamic chess exists in the opening, the middle game, and also the end game. And so it really depends a lot on us to see if we can detect them in the game. Now Ray Robson understands that this should still be a draw if he plays correctly. For example, bishop d5 he plays in the game, white plays bishop to c8 following the plan to attack the b7 pawn and to gobble out the pawn on the queen side. And right in this position where Ray Robson is in another critical moment in move 71, he blunders with a 50-50% chance. Exactly in this position, there's one only move to defend this position as black, and that move is knight to e4 check, giving a king check, but most importantly, keeping it out from the d6 square. And so after king to b6, the only move to the king to, let's say, keep an advantage on the queen side, black can play pawn to c5. Now the bishop defends the b7 pawn, it will never fall, everything kind of holds together, and even after pawn takes, this position is so locked up and white couldn't win this. This position is probably equal, the king is too close with the pawn, and so there's no pawn that will actually be promoted. The knight could also jump to the g5 square where it protects kind of everything in terms of pawn promoting. And so knight e4 will have defend, but this is pretty much the art, right, of dynamic chess, in which you're really placing your opponent in this kind of pressure where they always find it difficult to make a move. And moreover, this is basically the end game on move 70. The players probably have grinded out for 5-6 hours probably in this point. And so for Fabiano Caruana to sack the bishop on g5 to go into this position where only he has a chance of winning, I think this is one of the best games in 2021, even though there's no queen being involved in the sacrifice right here. But Ray Robson plays knight to e6 check. Now, the king can actually roam into d6, attacking the bishop and also the knight. So the move pawn c5 doesn't work anymore because obviously we can take the bishop. Also, the knight is just attacked twice. In this position, king to f7 is kind of forced, protecting the knight. But after bishop takes on b7, we know who's winning this position, with his pawn falling and white pawn actually kind of emerging into the 8th rank and promoting itself. And so yeah, I think the conclusion of the second game is that dynamic chess can occur in every part of the game, opening, middle game, and also the end game. Now at this point you might be confused, is dynamic chess all about sacrificing pieces then? Well, I'm here to announce that it's mostly not true. In fact, in this third game, it is all about placing your pieces on the most optimal square to actually create a problem for your opponent. For example, let's just dive deep into this position for a bit and think about whether black wants to move his knight to f4 or e3 in this position. Both knights move the same. It wants to attack the g2 square, exposing the light square so it can attack in with the queen to f3. Now all this nice for you to imagine, but certainly we can go into that later on. You can pause the video for a bit to see if you can actually solve it. I'll give you a couple of seconds. But the move is actually knight to f4 and not knight to e3. First of all, we're just going to look at why knight e3 is actually a mistake. Now it turns out that white has a defensive resource upon taking on d4. Suddenly, the defensive role the pawn has on d4 protecting the knight is gone, and the knight is already placed in imminent danger. So has to do something about it. You can't play bishop to d4 by the way because you're just losing pieces. Hope that's clear. But if you force knight to g2, again, white does not have to take on f3, does he? Obviously, again, if he takes on f3, this is losing. Queen to f3 check. And after king to g1, we can play bishop to d4 check. This is probably losing to him. We control all diagonal, all squares. But then he does not have to play that. In this position, white can place queen to d1, protecting the light squares, leaving the knight here hanging for the next turn to actually picked up. Not to mention the e5 bishop is also hanging. And so if you move this away, probably this bishop hangs as well. And this position would have been better for white. And the attack that black built up earlier will have vanished. Instead, Boris Gelfand found a great move and placed knight to f4. Now I can still try taking on d4, but after bishop takes on d4, this is a different story. This is a check to the king, the knight is not hanging, it's sitting here nicely on f4. The king can move to h1, but here we can play knight to g2. With the same idea, if the king takes on g2, we come in with our queen. This is kaput for black, but even if the queen comes here to d1, where it tries to protect light squares, the easiest continuation for black is to play knight to e3, attacking the queen. Hopefully everyone sees if queen to e1, we have queen to f3 check. This is probably made in 1 after the king moves somewhere. And so in this position, knight is forced to be taken. Now we're attacking the rook has to move, let's say move to c3. Where the idea is very common, we can play queen to e6. Where the idea is very common, we release the rook, attacking the first rank against the queen. And also we want to attack on the soft pawn here on f3. Excuse me, h3. So let's say if the rook takes on e3, we can play rook to f1 check. And if black is very stubborn and plays king to g2, protecting h3 square, just ignoring this bishop here on e3, we can play bishop to f1 check, and suddenly we can see the classic idea of the bishop and the queen ganging up, attacking the soft pawn on h3. To play chess more dynamically, sometimes it's also about, as this game suggested and proved, it's moving your pieces to the correct square. Also, some other ways to play more dynamically is to learn how to push your pawns in a way that creates a pressure for your opponent, and also how to actually make the correct exchange so that the tactic works in our favor. Both games are actually linked in the description below, so feel free to check them out. But in any case, I think it's time to wrap up the video. I hope you can really get a new idea to plug into your own game, to beat players in your own level, but also stronger players that are out of your league. Now if you find this video informative and also entertaining, please slam the like button,